I loved her. Against reason, against promise, against hope, against happiness, against all discouragement that could possibly be. In a broken world, filled with broken souls, a young boy was ignited with hope and prospect of a beautiful girl. The only problem was that her heart was stone, immovable, her face impassive, her gaze penetrating a refraction of his existence. He was Pip, she was Estella. And yes, this is Great Expectations, the best love story, but with so much more. Hey, it's Night Stranger back on the channel, also known as Simberly. So today, I really want to talk about Great Expectations, a book that I study for GCSE. But I think it's so much more than just a book I study for GCSE. Because Great Expectations was a book about love. It was a book about social class. It was also a book about self-improvement. It's also a book about family. Great Expectations was this book that it covered everything. And throughout the process of learning this book, throughout the process of actually reading it myself, I felt like it was an essential book for me to talk to you on this channel. And I really hope that you can enjoy this book. As many regard Dickens as, and people might think that Dickens is very waffly, right? People might think that Dickens have very long sentences. It's very hard to read Dickens. And that is completely true. It is difficult to read Dickens, but that's the fun of reading Dickens. It's so profound. Many of the things he says and the things that he evokes, the themes that he talks about in his book are so profound. And hence why I'm talking about Great Expectations, possibly the best book Dickens has ever written. In this book, Dickens goes through 3 key questions, or at least 3 key questions that I believe are truly worth thinking about. And I'm going to try to answer that throughout the process of my presentation today. The first one is what makes a good man, or also known as what makes a true gentleman. He talks about social class a lot, and he talks about how social class, at least as he perceived, may not be the definition of what a gentleman would be. Normally, the upper class people who with wealth, with knowledge, would be considered gentlemen. But Dickens really argues that a person, to really become a gentleman, needs to be a man of good character. And I'm going to expand onto this point, but keep that in mind. That's the first point I think is really key. Second point is, can social class determine everything? Because social class, or blood lineage back in the day, was considered the top most important thing. However, as the Industrial Revolution came into place, it was the 1800s, 1850s actually, when he written this book, blood lineage was decreasing, right? You can't say that a person has royal blood, that a person means high status, or at least like you can improve your status, your social status, if you're poor. There are ways for you to go from rags to riches. And that's something that he really explores. Can you really go from rags to riches? Or is it all phony? Can you only earn money, but you can never earn status? That's point number 2, right? Point number 3 is the nature versus nurture debate. I feel like this is such debate in modern day, but even back in the 1850s, this was very relevant. Dickens argues whether, he argues that parents change us, right? He argues that parental figures are one of the most important things in our childhood. And that's possibly true. That's probably true, right? You know, we are shaped by parents, but to what extent? He really illustrates in this book. Like, to what extent do we find out what we're really supposed to be? And to what extent that parental figures actually change us and not let us become the person we in our nature are supposed to be. So yeah, just keep those in mind. I'll be going through the 4 themes: love, social class, self-improvement, and parents. And now I'm going to give a book summary, a really short one if you didn't read this, probably like a 5-minute one. I'll be making this as brief as possible. So basically, the main character, Pip, was a young boy. And at the start of the story, this is completely out of the blue, right? He saves a convict. Convict meaning prisoner from potential death. He gave him food. But nevertheless, the convict got re-arrested. That was scene one. Completely no relation to any part of this book. So Pip grows up in an interesting household. He grows up with his sister and his sister's husband, who are called Mrs. Joe and Joe. And from the word go, you think that Mrs. Joe, goddamn, like who calls their sister Mrs. Joe, right? She took her husband's name. And you think about how, Pip and her are really not close. Because Pip lost his parents when he was a young child. And back in the day, it was very normal. So he lost both his parents, and he also lost 5 siblings. So like, at the start of the story, you're thinking, oh my god, this guy, like he's really a flawed character. Like, he's really not been brought up in a great way. And then on the other hand, Joe, who is this very genuine man, who is this man who's very obedient but also very kind, he really treats Pip well, like a friend. Whereas Mrs. Joe, his older sister, was very abusive and often beat him when he was younger. In this time of society, in the 1800s, people used to chase glory a lot. People used to chase social status. Effectively, that they were really bourgeoisie. And the one thing Mrs. Joe, Pip's sister, used to chase glory was she sent Pip to Miss Havisham, who was a wealthy woman in this area, in hopes of increasing her own social status, because I can say I'm related to Miss Havisham in this kind of way, and maybe they would get monetary benefits, right? So without Pip's consent, he sends Pip over to Miss Havisham. Little did she know that Miss Havisham is an interesting woman. She was jilted, meaning she was abandoned by her husband 20 years ago, and she never recovered from that. And the only thing she wanted to do was to torture men, because a man tortured her. She wants to inflict the same kind of pain she has felt on a man. So hence why she trained a young girl named Estella, who was adopted, to be completely cold, to be completely impassive towards any man. And that's what she did to Pip. Pip loved her because she was so beautiful, but she never loved him back. And she tormented him, and she lured him on. And that was the main part of the story, right? Pip and Estella. But it really gets so much deeper than that, just that. So Pip was like, since Estella's an upper class girl, and I'm a working class man, the only thing I can possibly attract her with is wealth and knowledge, right? As every man in this world thinks about as well. Because like, in a sense, that is true. Like, to attract a woman, you need to be wealthy and you need to have knowledge, right? So the thing Pip started to do was that he started to learn a bit of stuff about upper class. But realistically, you knew that Pip could never get into the upper class, right? And he confided with Biddy. Biddy was a household assistant back in his house about this kind of issue. He was like, oh, Biddy, I really want to become a gentleman, but I don't know how to. And I feel like this wealth would never come to me, even though I learned so much knowledge. And who knew? Because bang, in chapter 18, Pip received a huge amount of money from an anonymous benefactor. So he did not know who sent him the money. But he received a great amount of wealth, and he was like, oh my god, this is my chance. This is my chance to become the gentleman, to gain knowledge, to gain power, and to, in the end, marry Estella, because that's everything he always wanted to do. That was his destiny. That was his purpose, right? He was 18 by the time. He liked this girl for 10 years. And he hasn't seen Estella for probably like 5. Because Estella moved abroad to France. We don't really talk about that. So he received all this money. He got moved to London because he's a rich man now. Young man, rich man. And he moved in with the Pockets. The Pockets were aristocracy. They were minor aristocracy. And they were related to Miss Havisham, who the anonymous benefactor wanted him to grow up with. And he's like, let me think about this. Maybe Miss Havisham sent me money. Maybe Miss Havisham really wants me to marry Estella. And he's like, oh my god, I actually have a chance. Yeah, maybe. Maybe he did. Who knows? But one sec. Coffee break. Bang, cheers. But he actually really made friends with Herbert and Matthew Pocket, who was the father of Herbert Pocket. They really became friends, and Herbert was the person who really introduced him to the upper class world. It was like, how do I be a gentleman? How do I have manners enough to please a woman, for example? Like, even to be decent as an upper class man. However, as Pip received this amount of money, he slowly started to get in debt because he was gambling all this time. He was spending money on crazy clothes. Right? He was trying to impress women. He was trying to be like, oh my god, he's so like bourgeoisie, you know? Like, that's a word I'm going to use a lot, like bourgeoisie, because it talks a lot about how materialistic things cannot define a person's true character. And it didn't. Pip was becoming a person who people despised because, first of all, how he treated Joe, who was his long-term friend and his adoptive father. And he was ashamed of Joe. Like, how can you be ashamed of your own parent? But he was. He really was. When Joe visited him in London, he said this line. He was like, I really don't want Joe to be seen by Bentley Drummle, who is this enemy of his, right? Because Joe was so common, he was so coarse, he was so uneducated, right? It was crazy. And because of this ignorance, because of this arrogance, Pip was perceived as a person who really, didn't benefit from the money. He didn't get Estella, even though he visited Estella a lot, he met Estella a lot. But he was actually drowning in the money. He was actually in this big ocean of wealth, but it was diminishing and it was changing him. And it was really making him a person who was questionable. And he thought that he could get Estella. He really thought. There was chapters in this book where he just met Estella. He was like he was really blatant with his love. He was blatant to tell Estella that, I love you. I love you so much. Right? There's chapters in this book that say, like, at the start of the book, I loved her against all possible happiness will. Like, he did. He really did. And one line I'm going to repeat later in this book is, "You're every line that I ever read." Such a good quote. "You're every line I ever read." How romantic. But, like, Estella didn't care. She was, like, stone cold. She was like, nah, ain't no way. I'm loving you back. I want to torture you still. Right? And it got to that, probably, like, halfway through the book. Then you really get this huge revelation. Because Dickens reintroduced the convict. And guess what? The convict was actually the anonymous benefactor. He, the man who remembered that Pip saved him with bread, he came back and saved him. Although, you perhaps think it was very noble of him, but in a sense we do get the feeling that since society failed him, since he was a convict, since he was sent to Australia, because that's what convicts usually were sent to back in the day, to Australia to populate the British colonies, he really wanted to prove the government wrong. He wanted to prove the aristocracy wrong. He wanted to prove the class system wrong. He wanted to prove that even though he's in the lowest class, so the lowest class is like orphans, it was like convicts, it was like maids, servants, right? Then it was working class, there was like blacksmith, like what Joe is. Then there's the upper class, like gentleman, right? He wanted to prove that from the lowest class, he can make a gentleman. And that's exactly what he made Pip. And his relationship with Pip was very interesting. Because Pip at the start, he was devastated. He was like, Miss Havisham really doesn't want me to marry Estella after all. It was actually a hoax. But gradually he realised that Magwitch, or the convict's name, Magwitch, was actually a genuine man. He was a man that really wanted to make change. And Pip helped him in the end. He tried to help Magwitch escape, but through the river Thames, but they were caught by the police, and in the end he died. But it was really a process of becoming and a process of epiphanies that shaped Pip's view towards this great man. Another part of the book that was very significant was him confessing to Estella, because Estella finally, to make the biggest torture of all, she decided to marry Bentley Drummle, who was Pip's greatest enemy, right? Just to absolutely torture the hell out of this man. And Pip made this confession. He was like, you know, I love you more than everything in this world. But what Miss Havisham makes you to marry Bentley Drummle, because Miss Havisham basically controls Estelle for everything, was that I know that you wouldn't be happy. And even though I know you're never going to marry me, I want you to be happy. But she didn't listen, and she married Bentley Drummle. Shortly afterwards, Miss Havisham had a great confession. She was like, maybe everything I did to Estella was wrong. Then she died. Like, she got burned by the fire. And that's when the book got to the end. Pip started realizing the genuine people, the actual gentlemen in his life, are like people like Joe and Biddy. Right, his adoptive father, Biddy, Magwitch, these are genuine people. Rather than the aristocracy you see with Miss Havisham, they are really flawed. So hence why he became humble. He became a working man himself, right? He said, I'm going to step down from the upper class system. I'm in this much debt. The only thing I can possibly do is work right now. And he worked. And towards the end of the book, he met Estella again. And that was like a bittersweet ending, because they were like, we're both so lost, we're both so broken, and we both got molded by people who we didn't want to be molded by. But in the end, they became friends. And I'm gonna talk a bit more about how they became friends, but it's a bittersweet ending. They never got a happy ending that everyone expected. So yeah, it's basically a summary. That's actually quite a good summary. It's like what I can do in 10 minutes. Alright. Now I really want to talk about like a few themes in the book. The first one being the theme of love. Can love truly be justified? This is a quote from the book, what Miss Havisham said. I'll tell you what real love is. It's blind devotion, unquestioning self-humiliation, utter submission, trust and belief against yourself and against the whole world, giving up your whole heart and soul to the smiter. Pip loved her, unrelentingly, incessantly, unconditionally. Yet his love was a one-way ticket from paradise. From this quote, you can tell that love is perceived very negatively in this book. I feel like Dickens throughout the whole book mentions how love is the thing that can kill you. It can empower you, but throughout the most of the books we see the relationships here, right? We see Mrs. Joe and Joe. It really didn't feel well for both of them. Sure, they were in a relationship, they never loved each other. You think about Miss Havisham and the person, his old husband that jilted her, right? Absolutely killed off Miss Havisham's entire body, right? She was this woman in this bride robe 20 years after she was supposed to marry this man. She changed, and she had PTSD from this event. And it was just absolutely terrible. You think about Pip and Estella. Like, Pip absolutely loved this girl, but Estella never loved him back. You think in the end about Estella and Drummle, who I didn't talk about in the summary, but they did not end up well. Like, Miss Drummle was actually a really abusive man, and he abused Estella, and Estella got a divorce in the end. The only relationship that was really highlighted by Dickens as a happy love ending was Joe and Biddy. So in the end, after Mrs. Joe died from the injury that she suffered from her head, Joe remarried Biddy, who was the caretaker in the house. And I think the reason Dickens highlights that they were the only happy couple in this entire story was because they were both genuine people. They were both kind people. They were both people that deserved a happy ending. So what Dickens also really tries to evoke is the power of kindness, the power of generosity. That God always repays the person who is kind, who gives back. And yeah, it's very deep. All right, the second thing that Dickens really illustrates is that love is unrequited. So you don't get anything in return. You see this theme replayed like multiple times in this book. Pip says, "Your every line that I ever read." What did Stella respond with? Her cold, careless smile that always chilled him. Right? She didn't care. She was like, "Nah, I don't care." He gave her all his love, but he didn't get anything in return. It's unrequited. And you also think about Joe to Pip, right? Joe gave Pip all his love. Joe cared about Pip. Joe was kind to Pip. Joe willingly, towards the end of the book, saved Pip from debt. He managed to pay off all of Pip's debt. Whereas he was a working class man, he must have saved up all this money to help Pip survive in the end. But did Pip give him anything in return? Towards the end, maybe. But one line that Pip really said was that I failed Joe. I really didn't live up to this kind man, this great man. A really telling quote by Miss Havisham that illustrates the whole Pip and Estelle situation was, "Love her, love her, love her. If she favors you, love her. If she wounds you, love her. If she tears your heart to pieces as he gets older and stronger, it will tear deeper. Love her, love her, love her." Damn. Damn. I need one more water, bro. So tiring doing this. ASMR. Alright. The last key theme in love, or sub-theme, was love and family. Dickens really argues that family does not equal necessarily love. It doesn't mean unrelenting love. It doesn't mean that you have to incessantly love someone. And an example could be how, like, Joe loved Pip, right? Pip never loved him back, never really loved him back until the end. He never realized how much of a character, how much Joe cared, even though they were not really family. It was an adoptive father. And in contrast with the same thing you see with Miss Havisham and Estella, right? They were sort of family, right? It was adoptive mother and adoptive daughter. But did they really love each other? Towards the end of the book, Miss Havisham and Estella had this really big row. They were arguing. And Estella was like, "You tried to change me. You molded me. I'm everything you made me. And I can't be myself." So do you think Miss Havisham really loved her? I don't think so. I think Miss Havisham was a person who actually wasn't gifted with the ability to love because she loved her ex-husband so unrelentingly. And it just shows how family does not necessarily mean that you get love, right? Pip was beaten by his sister. You also think about, like, Herbert Pocket, his family. It was very dysfunctional. They were all glory chasers, right? You think about their relationship, how futile that must be. So, in the end, what is his conclusion? I think his conclusion, more or less, is that you don't have to be family to love. You don't have to be family to care. Especially through, like, Joe. He wasn't Pip's family. He wasn't like Pip's family. You see through Magwitch, he wasn't Pip's family, but he cared. And maybe blood doesn't mean anything, Dickens argues. He argues that blood doesn't mean that you love someone. Blood only means that you're connected by blood. It's as simple as that. He hints about, like, aristocracy in this sense. He talks about how aristocracy doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that you're born with purple blood or like aristocracy, that you can really do all these powerful things, right? It doesn't mean you're knowledgeable. It doesn't mean you're nice. It just means that you have a title. And Dickens argues that these kind of titles are futile because it doesn't show the content of your character. Although I said all of that about Pip, about how he didn't love Joe back, Pip actually had a confession. It went like this. He was talking to Joe's son, right? Joe had a new son, and Joe named the son Pip. He said, "Don't tell him, Joe, that I was thankless. Don't tell him, Biddy, that I was ungenerous and unjust. Only tell him that I honored you both, because you both were so good and true." He realized, but that wasn't enough. It was really not enough. But it was kind of Pip's redemption in a sense. He was a castaway figure, he was a flawed figure, but in the end he did realize what was true, what was the best for him. And what was best, it was that glitter in his life. It was Joe and Biddy. So yeah. Alright. The next theme I really want to explore is social class. Especially the question, what makes a true gentleman? A quote from this book, said by Matthew Pocket, which was the mentor of Pip when he became when he became the upper class citizen, when he became a gentleman, was, "No varnish can hide the grain of wood, and the more that you put varnish on, the more the grain will express itself." In this world of mass production and manufacturing, Pip was given one hope: to become a gentleman, a true gentleman, in order to marry his beloved. Nonetheless, through his ascent from rags to riches, he discovered so much more about nobility. Namely, can you make a gentleman? I think the quote really tells you about how no varnish can hide the wood. How it's basically a quote that tells you about no matter what clothes you put in your body, no matter what wealth is in your pocket, it doesn't matter. It doesn't hide you from who you truly are. It only reveals your character really is, how terrible your character really is. It shows how insecure you are. It shows how much of a fraud you are, right? These kind of things. And I think that's a huge statement made by Dickens. A gentleman, by only materialistic values, by only materialistic things, does not mean that you're a true gentleman. It only means that you're insecure and that you're bourgeoisie. I really want to talk about the social hierarchy of this book, because back in the 1800s, it was a bit different from what it is now. At least there's sort of a social hierarchy now. Well, there always is, but it's less defined and it's more flexible compared to 1800s. So social hierarchy was that on the lower class, there was Estella's adoptive mother. I didn't talk about this much, but she was adopted, and her adoptive mother was actually a maid, was actually a servant. Excuse me. So it was on the lowest class. So it was very conflicting because Estella was actually from a lower class than Pip, but that's a story for another day. There was also the convict who was a prisoner, right? He was also on the lowest class. There was then, you move up to the working class, was Joe and Biddy. You think about Pumblechook, who was the uncle of Pip and a glory seeker as well. And you think about the upper class, who was Miss Havisham and Estella and the Pockets. However, you really look at Mrs. Pocket. Although the men of the Pocket family are actually very genuine, Mrs. Pocket was a person who was very phony. Was a person who was a fraud. And the only thing she wanted, because she was such a hollow character, was money, was status. And when you only chase for those things, how can you become a good person? Pip said this really good quote about Mrs. Pocket. And it shows a lot of people, at least like in modern day as well. You only chase for money, power. But who are you? What are you to chase those such highly valued things when you don't have the foundation, right? When you don't have the foundational values of humility, of generosity, of authenticity. And that's where I think the book really tells you about real life. Pip says, Mrs. Pocket had grown up highly ornamental, but perfectly helpless and useless. Let me repeat that. That's so good. Mrs. Pocket has grown up highly ornamental, but perfectly helpless and useless. I think this quote really tells you about, such as the word ornamental, really tells you about how much she values the actual like physical things. But she was helpless and useless. She was no good to anyone. She was no value to society. And I think Dickens really dives deep into what means that you have good value. What he really said was not good value, was that you chase for these things. But what was good value was that you want to develop in yourself, which was what exactly Pip did. Dickens didn't illustrate Pip to be this antagonist, as many people see. People see that Pip is such a flawed character. He's such an antagonist. No, Pip is the main protagonist in the story. Pip is all of us. Pip is all of us that grown up from flawed backgrounds. We all did. Realistically, no one had a picture perfect childhood, right? And he had to go through these all stages. He really had to fall to get back up. And that's the thing I respect about Pip the most. No matter how many times he fell, he actually always redeemed himself. Maybe not completely, but you can never completely redeem your childhood innocence, right? He was a great kid back when he was younger. But from all these times he'd been told that he was working class, that he had coarse hand, that he was common, right? You can't help but feel sorry for him. He was 12, man. He was getting told all these things, that he was working class, he was not worthy of a Stella, he was not this great man that he really wanted to be. And through these criticisms, Pip's faced it harder than many of us. Although we did all face criticism, but never explicitly, or I hope not explicitly for any viewer, about their class, right? Because the class is definitely more nuanced now. Or less nuanced. Less nuanced, that's what I mean. Like it's more like a spectrum rather than a defined triangle, I think. And it was a story of becoming. It was how he stood up to all these things, how he tried to become materialistic, how he tried to become upper class. And he really realized the power of Joe, the power of Magwitch, how these genuine people treat him in his life. Then in the end, he became a kind person himself, is kind-hearted. It's that process of 20 years that you really see how a man can turn into a flawed character, but he can redeem himself. And I think that's why it's such a good book. Because it's a story that everyone goes through. And many people are not even as willing to learn as Pip. I know that if you're watching this video until the 34th minute, you want to learn. You really want to learn. Unlike most people, you're that 1%. You're truly that 1%. Because most people, unlike Pip, don't even want to learn. They don't want to improve. Pip wanted. Right, although I said all of those good things about Pip, he did say in chapter 15, I wanted to make Joe less ignorant and common, that he might be worthier of my society. Wow. Damn. Yeah, he was not a good boy when he was like 15, you know. He was a flawed character. I'm lost. I think I really want to answer this question posed by Dickens in this novel. was, can you make a true gentleman? The two key things that are subpoints of this main question was, can gentlemen be taught, and can gentlemen be bought? So taught meaning knowledge, bought meaning money. And I think the answer to that question is quite clear. You can't. Because that's not the definition of gentleman. The true definition of gentleman is judged by the content of their character. That's what Martin Luther King said, the content of their character. I'm going to repeat this so many times because it's such a good quote. And you see, there's two scenarios where people really try to make, quote unquote, gentlemen. And I don't think, it could be argued that when Magwitch tried to make Pip a gentleman, he actually succeeded, in a sense. So Pip was made a gentleman, but he really never truly achieved his dream of marrying Estella. He was never that man, he was never the alpha male, right? And he also went into debt. He was this person who was gambling a lot. He was wasting his life away, getting through the day, waiting for the weekend. Nah. But yeah, he was morally flawed, right? He went into debt. He gambled his money away. So realistically, was he a gentleman? It could be argued that he got better. But was he truly of that value yet? Right? I think Dickens posed that at the end of the story. Is Pip good enough yet? And the answer is no, he's not. But at least he's trying. The Dickens says at least he's trying, unlike most people. Right. Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham really wants to make Estella a gentleman, sort of, like gentlewoman, whatever you call it. Right, a lady. Because she really did. She adopted Estella into this very wealthy family. However, as much as Estella looks and walks, right? This is phrase about Estella in this book is about how she walked with absolute dignity, this perfect dignity, and her beautiful strides or whatever, stuff like that, you know? Like, she really was, like, already physically a lady. But morally, Dickens argues otherwise. She didn't marry a good husband because she wanted to torture people. How can that be ladylike, you know, ladylike things that you do? She married Bentley Drummle just to get rid of Pip. She was also unhappy at Miss Havisham's upbringing, showing that how, although she was made a true lady, was she really happy about where she came from? And it just really posed a lot of questions, you know, was she really a lady? She wasn't. And also she was morally flawed towards Pip, towards people, like in general, servants. They were very cold-hearted, looking down upon them, very arrogant, very proud. That's one word used to describe Estella, proud. And this quote shows a lot. Although they were both morally flawed, there was a kind of revelation. It was a kind of revelation that the people who made them necessarily didn't expect it to turn out wrong. They were Frankenstein's monsters, quote unquote. The quote goes as follows. Estella said in chapter 33, "We have no choice, you and I, but to obey our instructions. We are not free to follow our own devices, you and I," to Pip. And they were not. They really weren't. They were not allowed to have this kind of big dream of themselves because the path was already made for them. And the people who made the paths, namely Magwitch and Miss Havisham, really wanted them to follow the path that they led, right? And they couldn't have any freedom. I think Dickens also talks about freedom quite a lot in this book. What is true freedom? Because you can say that being in the upper class means freedom, but really? Pip had all this money. Surely that meant that he had all the freedom in the world. He had all the connections in the world. He was a true gentleman. But he didn't have freedom because he didn't know how to live his life. He didn't know how to truly embrace the values that shaped him. He got into debt as well. Like, all this money doesn't do anything. Did Estella really have freedom? Right, in the end, when choosing his husband, she really referred back to how Miss Havisham wanted her to choose a person who absolutely destroyed other men. She didn't really have freedom. So yeah, how parental figures shape your freedom as well is also a huge theme in this book. So at last, what are the true gentlemen in this book? Gentlemen in this book. There's Joe, Billy, Lady, and Magwitch. And the last quote I really want to pose in this theme is Pip towards Magwitch. Because it was a huge revelation, he realised that Magwitch was actually a genuine man who wanted good for him, although he might have not portrayed his feelings in the correct way. He said, I only saw in him a much better man than I had been to Joe. He was really, really regretful of what happened to Joe. And it was this, he realised, maybe the person who brought me up was actually meaning good. But it was like, we took it different ways. So, short summary of what I really talked about. It was how a gentleman is perceived by the content of the character rather than in wealth and knowledge. Theme 2. Alright. Now I really want to get on to a third theme of the story, and that is self-improvement. Namely, how to become a better person. I'm going to start with this quote. What Pip said in chapter 22. It was when he first became a gentleman. But he really understood the principle of a true gentleman already, but he just never followed it. He said, no man who was not a true gentleman at heart ever was, since the world began, a true gentleman in manner. Swept under the currents of fear and injustice, Pip's cognition became blurred with the thoughts of wealth and status, so much so that his actions were immoral. Nevertheless, with the careful nurturing of Joe and Magwitch, he rediscovered what makes a good man, thus striving to become a better individual. Dickens makes self-improvement a theme that's more or less omnipresent. It's not the key theme of the book, but the book is called a Bildungsroman, which means that Roman means book, and Bildung probably means like building on this book. So a character building on himself in this book. And Dickens really writes a redemption arc for Pip. He writes about how he was a questionable character towards the middle, whereas at the start he was a good character. And at the end, it was gradually him trying to improve more and more to become that good character again. Pip, the name, was not chosen by coincidence. Pip means a small seed in a fruit that really symbolizes growth and rebirth. And I think that's key to the story. Pip was that person who was reborn, right? He was that person who really tried to give birth to himself again, to reparent himself again, because of all the flawed things that he received when he was younger. I think this is a very short little phrase. Estella said in chapter 59 to Pip that I've been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. That was also them building on themselves. It was also Estella realizing that in the end, we are going to be friends because we've all been through so much. We've been bent and broken. But hopefully, we're better now. Hopefully, you understand everything better. And that's the true meaning of a Bildungsroman. It doesn't mean that they end up this perfect character, no. But they are just less flawed. They just understand the world that little bit better. And this is since this is very short, I want to just give a very short summary. Dickens says that a good man is a virtuous man. Now I want to talk about the last theme of this book I really explored. It was parents, nature versus nurture. As always, I'm going to start from a quote. And this quote is a quote that Miss Havisham said to Pip about Stella. How she was really regretful of what happened. And as a parent, as an adoptive parent, she was very sympathetic. She was very compassionate about what happened. But she couldn't take anything back. Miss Havisham said in chapter 49, "Believe this, when she first came to me, I meant to save her from misery like my own. I stole her heart away and put ice in its place." Pip was beat by Tickler. Estella was moulded into a killer. As much as saviors in real life, Dickens portrays parents as the enemy. He really does. Dickens really portrays that there's no perfect parent figure, except for maybe Joe. Magwitch was flawed, right? He was a convict. How can he possibly be an adequate parent figure? Although he was a good man, he was never a true gentleman like Joe. There's also Miss Havisham, right? Dickens illustrates there's so many orphans in this book. There's Pip, there's Biddy, there's Magwitch, there's Estella. There's also so many dysfunctional families. There was Miss Havisham, there was Herbert Pocket, it was Joe. And people always come from like these kind of broken families in this book. Maybe just, I think Dickens is trying to say that it's so important to have a real family. Although you can teach everything by yourself, it's so important to have that father figure or mother figure in your life. It's so important to have a person who can really guide you to become a better person rather than you going the path yourself and falling into all these ditches and holes. And he really says, it's very telling about how society used to be back then, you know, because people died very often because there was less medicine, there was less hospitals, there was less care for people. And Dickens really illustrates how a lot of people are orphans. It's very normal. Which just shows the preciousness of our family right now. Like, at least I know that of both my parents, and I'm very grateful. And I hope that you also do as well. And I pity you if you don't. Because parents are the people that shape us. The people who really help us into becoming who we are. Although parents could be, as Miss Havisham is, a person who really nurtured you into the wrong direction. Although Stella really came back to her true nature towards the end of the book, it was like really regretful, I've been bent and broken into better shape. But maybe Miss Havisham nurtured her a bit too far. Tagging along with that point, Pip and Estella in this book was perceived as Frankenstein's monsters. For all of those who know Mary Shelley, Frankenstein was, I think, it was either the scientist or the monster that was made. But apparently Frankenstein was a monster made by a scientist from an experiment went wrong. It was not exactly what the scientist wanted to create, but it was a complete monster that he created. And Dickens really tries to say that both Estella and Pip are monsters made by their parents. So Miss Havisham and Magwitch. They were both made flawed characters. There's two quotes I want to say, very short. Quote number one is what Miss Havisham said in chapter 38. As if she was devouring the beautiful creature that she read. It was a direct reference to Frankenstein's monster. It was a creature. It was Estella. She was devouring, like she was so happy that Estella was torturing Pip. How out of your mind do you have to be? She was devouring. Such a powerful, powerful word. Stella also said in the same chapter, she realized that what was happening to her. She realized that she was a failed experiment. She was a person that could have been so much more, that was limited by her parent. She said, I am what you made me to, Miss Havisham. Take all the praise, take all the blame, take all the success, take all the failure. In short, take me. In short, take me. I don't think I have to explain much about this quote. Miss Havisham was everything. She was everything in Estelle's life, because she controlled her absolutely. And Dickens just makes us reflect on how a parent should not absolutely control a child, should not absolutely empower the child with everything. For example, Pip. I think there's a very juxtaposed contrast here. There's Estella, who was controlled by Miss Havisham with practically everything. There was Pip, who's empowered with so much money that he didn't know how to do. I think Dickens really talks about the perfect balance in this book. How there's always a balance to something. How the balance is that you can't be completely free, as he talks about freedom, right? Or you can't be completely restricted. There's a thing where you can be empowered with certain things, but you also got to be led on certain roads to really understand what a kind man really should be. And that hence led to Pip's remorse. It was that he felt like, because he was raised in this way, he was arrogant towards his parents. Arrogant towards Joe, who's actually a real man. He was just not particularly a good teacher. He said in chapter 39, the deepest pain and the sharpest of all was that I deserted Joe. And he said towards Magwitch in chapter 55, when Magwitch is about to die, for now, my repugnance to Magwitch has completely melted away. And in that hunted, wounded, shackled creature who held my hand in his, I only saw a man who had meant to be my benefactor, and who had felt affectionately, gratefully, generously towards me, with great constancy throughout the years. So yeah, he was remorseful. And as a summary I can give for the entire theme, I think Dickens really challenges that parent might not be as good as guardians, maybe, because Magwitch and Joe were both guardians, or vice versa, because Miss Havisham was actually a critical person in Estella's life, who absolutely killed her off, who absolutely destroyed that fight within her. So yeah, there you go. Great Expectations, the best love story that could have been. It was a good love story. It's absolutely amazing. I absolutely love the book. Like, it's so good. Just look at all those highlights and I'm like, bro, I love this book so much. And I can't explain how much I want to recommend this book to you. And I think this book really changed me. It was really how much, like, I love my parents right now. It was completely different before I read this book. I think I wasn't as close to them. I wasn't as giving back. I wasn't as attentive to them. They really gave me everything. Such like Joe. I was not particularly arrogant, but I felt like I was ignorant towards that love. And now I feel like it's a time of maturity that tells you really, like, give back to your parents. They really mean the world to you, and you mean the world to them. It was told me about love. Right? There's a lot of, like, love couldn't be always perceived as this wonderful thing. As much as everyone wants to think that love is a beautiful thing, which it is, of course it is a thing that is also, it could kill you. Like it killed Pip. Like love killed Pip. And that's a very deep point. Also taught me about the true values of a man. It taught me about the values of, like, humility, about acceptance, about authenticity, generosity, justice. These points really popped out to me from this book. And I think that's how Dickens really wants you to live. As a genuine man in this world that is so chaotic. To end this book review, whatever you like to call it, I want to read the last chapter, or at least the last part of the chapter to you, because I think it's the perfect way to end it, because I absolutely love Dickens's ending. It's so ambiguous. He didn't give Pip and Estelle a happy ending. It was ambiguous. It was whether they're going to date, whether they're going to have, like, make love, whether they're going to have children, you know. But you said to me, returned Estella, very earnestly, God bless you. God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you would not hesitate to say that to me now. Now when the suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I've been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. That plosive literary. Be considerate. Be as considerate and good to me as you were. And tell me that we are friends. We are friends, said I, rising and bending over her, as she rose from the bench. And we'll continue friends apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mists had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and the broad expanse of the tranquil light they showed me, I saw the shadow of no parting from her. Thank you very much for watching this book review. I love you. See you next one. Bye-bye.